we need to like think of it a little bit differently, where it's like, we got to convince them to buy anything. Then we decide who we lose to. If you lose to status quo, you really just lost to not being able to convince them there's a big enough problem, which...
That's absolutely money.
Yeah. Yeah. That is interesting.
Are you forming that thought in real time? Because it seemed like a really great, already formed concept.
Smoke is starting to come out of my ears.
We're done here.
Working overdrive here.
Proof. That's what I think of every morning when I fire up LinkedIn and scroll through boring manifestos and endless lukewarm takes, because opinions are cheap and proof is gold. I'm Mark Huber, and this is The Proof Point, a show from User Evidence that helps go-to-market teams find new ideas, frameworks, and tactics that actually work today. Each episode includes an unfiltered discussion with the biggest names in B2B SaaS to help me find the proof points that I'm in search of. Hot takes, always welcome. On today's episode of The Proof Point, we'll have some friendly and familiar UE faces with a few of our marketing advisors, and we're going to talk about all things messaging, how to get messaging that actually works and roll it out to the rest of your go-to-market team. First up, we've got Jen Allen-Knuth. She's somebody who I've only gotten to know for a few months now, but I love every conversation that I have with her. She truly knows her stuff, and the way that she thinks about sales is just different, and it's much needed in B2B SaaS. Next up, we have Jason Oakley. He's the founder of Productive PMM, one of the best product marketers I know, and someone I've looked up to for a long time. He's schooled me on product marketing for much longer than he knows. And last up, we've got Kaylee Edmondson. Kaylee is the founder of DemandLoops, from her days at Chili Piper to Refine Labs. She is one of my most trusted marketers that I know, and that I'm fortunate to call a friend. She's one of the few people that loves nerding out over marketing just as much as I do and hates fluff, my kind of people. So Jen, why does sales not use the messaging that marketing comes up with?
Well, I'm not going to make any marketers as new friends today, but the messaging we often get from marketing assumes that prospect gives so many fucks about what we do and why we're the best at it. But in reality, when you're a salesperson in a conversation with a prospect, they really couldn't give any less fucks about that in the first call. And that is the hardest call that we have as AEs. And so a prospect will look us in the face. They'll tell us, you're right, you're better. You do have a better solution than what we're doing today or compared to anybody else, but we're still going to push this thing out to 2024. So in my opinion, most marketing messages are fighting the wrong fight. It's a fight of we're better, when in reality, the fight that we sellers are up against is this a problem even worth prioritizing to solve right now?
That's interesting.
All right, so Jason, good take. The product marketer in you is probably just like dying inside. And
I think it's right.
But like, what do you think?
I think you're right. No, I think that, and it's like a very good point. I think that there's like, why do you come into a conversation? Like, how could you expect to come into a conversation trying to tell someone why they should choose your product when they're like, I don't even have a problem worth solving at this point. I think that's, and so I do think that like a lot of times product marketers, especially now since there's such a focus these days on positioning and differentiation and everything is all about like, how are we better than the rest of the alternatives out there? But a big part of positioning is understanding like what problem you solve for that specific buyer. And I don't think enough of a focus is put on that. Like, it's very interesting. And I think that, different messaging for different situations, right? Someone comes to your website or let's say your website, for example, someone comes to your website organically, like inbound, chances are they know they have a problem. Or like chances are there's a good portion of them who know they have a problem, they want to solve it. And so they're actively looking at alternatives and they're actively like, okay, like tell me why I should choose yours. Or at least I have a problem, tell me how you were going to solve it. But like a lot of early sales conversations, like, especially if it's like booked by an SDR, like sometimes they're like, why am I even on this call? Like, what is it? What are you talking about? And so I hear you. I understand the struggle, Jen.
Are we still friends?
I do get that. It's interesting. Yeah.
So we're not just going to rag on messaging the entire time, but Kaylee, I want to get your take first before I tee up the rest of what we're talking about.
Well, I think that like logic-based journeys is where my head goes. I will say for several of my clients right now, we're in Q4, so I'm getting a lot of screenshots of objections, which is maybe one of the like most real-time feedback loops I've ever had with, especially on a client, like on a consulting basis. And it's actually quite eye-opening because they are coming up a lot against this. Everybody's like, oh, we're punting, we're deferring, no budget, not a priority. And I'm like, oh shit, like we actually don't have anything in the can for that. But my head immediately at the front end, like on my day-to-day, goes to like logic-based journeys. Where did they come from? What are they seeing? So typically, especially this is one client that's top of mind for me right now, we have a couple of logic-based journeys based on how they get referred to us. And some of the hardest ones that we're coming up against for objection handling is either A, like my boss is punting me to come and deal with y'all. And so like me, I'm like being forced to be the champion, but I don't really want to be here. But like my boss told me I have to be here. Oh, like those are becoming the worst to try and get ahead of some of their objections. Or secondarily, like I've been referred through some random DM chain where somebody in a group told me I need you. So now I'm here and I'm kind of doing due diligence alongside you and 12 others. So like, how are you going to stand out? I think those are the two where we're like doing a lot of journey mapping and logic mapping to try and get ahead of it. But this whole like, you're not a prio, we're punting to 24. Like this client in particular doesn't have a good solve for it right now. And I like also none of us that are writing these words have ever been in their shoes. So I think there's a gap there that's interesting for us to try and like solution.
Yeah. It's interesting to think of like, it's really comes down to a question of where are they in part of that buying process. And because if you're talking to a champion, it's like they might be bought into the problem themselves. But like I'd imagine a lot of times if you're in like Q4 and a deal's just going nowhere, a lot of times it's because they just can't communicate to their boss, right? Or whomever signs off on a deal. And so in those cases, it's like still, you're not even at the stage yet where you need to tell them why you're better. You're at a stage where you need to convince the champion or tell the champion what to tell their boss to like prioritize this project.
And that is the thing, the number one thing that salespeople always tell me they don't get from marketing. It's like, here's the thing when the customer decides or the prospect decides they want to do something and now they're making a decision about what to do. It's like, here's our pretty collateral, but how do I get someone there? Because in a world where like, I saw this stat, I keep saying it, it's probably people are probably like, can you shut up about it? But it was saying last year, I think there was 21,000 SaaS companies. Next year, there's 75 freaking thousand SaaS companies. Yeah. Like all of a sudden now it's not what is the best thing within my category. It's like now our competition is 16 other ways that we might solve the problem. So it doesn't matter if I'm the best one in my category. It's like maybe they reorg, maybe they bring in a different leader. There's all these different solutions people might think about. So the biggest, hardest battle is the one I think we sellers are often least equipped to win. I'll get off my soapbox.
That's good.
No, I mean, I love having every one of you on your soapboxes. That's the whole point of the show. So I think what I want to do to kind of tee like the startup of maybe what not to do, like we all have very different experiences and probably have been burned quite a bit of doing this the wrong way. So maybe Jason, I'll kick it to you since this is really a product marketing thing or in many cases originates in product marketing. Like where do you see B2B marketers starting and really should not be starting?
Yeah. I think like there are lots of places you could start, I guess, if I'm understanding the question correctly. But I think that if I was to think of like where not to start, it would definitely be don't start alone in the dark in your own little, bubble and try to come up with messaging on your own. And I think that unfortunately a lot of product marketers do that where you're kind of like, all right, I've got to figure this out. I'm going to, you do your own research and then you try to come up with some sort of messaging document. And that's definitely not the right place to start. I've been there, I've done that. And, you waste all kinds of time, right? And it never works out. So I would say like, that's probably the worst place to start, that or just looking at your competition, right? Like sometimes a good place, sometimes it can feel right. And you can look at your competitor does and say, okay, we need to be different than that. Or they're doing this, so we need to also say that, or because we can't not say that because people are looking for that sort of thing. I think that those are probably the two places I would try to avoid starting with as a starting point for sure. Yeah. What about you? Like Mark, you come from this world too. Yeah. What about you? Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I laugh because the first thing that you said of what not to do is the exact thing that I did the first time that I went through this. And I thought, hey, I'm marketing to marketers. I know what I should be saying. I know how to say it. I know all of these things, and said, all right, here's what I've worked on by myself for the last, however many weeks. It's ready to go. And then you roll it out to the leadership team or your sales leader, your AEs, and no one gives a shit. And nor should they if you go about it that way. And Kaylee and Jason, like, you all did this together at Chili Piper back in the day. Like, how did you go about this?
Go about messaging? It's Chili Piper. Chili Piper was an interesting one. I think that, and so I have an interest, I think when I think of where to start with messaging, because at an early stage startup, because when we started at Chili Piper, it was 40, 50 people, maybe less.
If that. Yeah.
Our big team was definitely small. It was it was us and CMO. And when you have a founder or co-founders who are so passionate about the product and are influencing the messaging a ton, you at an early stage startup like that, you can't help but start with the founder in some cases, right? It's starting there. It is going to be heavily influenced there. And so at Chili Piper, we did it kind of. It happened in a number of different ways, but a lot of times it's heavily influenced by sales and it's heavily influenced by founders, right? And luckily, Chili Piper had a really interesting product where the messaging on it, at least for concierge, was so clear. It was the clear problem that it solved. Everyone was pretty aligned on it, and so a lot of it was it was a very easy thing to message and explain to people. And it's interesting where when you have a product like that is just so easy to understand the problem that it solves and then the value of it and explain the ROI, it's so crystal clear. It's almost if you
caveat though.
Well, yeah, go ahead with the caveat. I was just going to say that is an awesome place to be. Most companies don't have that, and it's not that clear. But yeah, Kaylee,
it's a luxury.
Caveat though, when I first got there, which was a step and a jump right after Jason got there, our application of who we thought we were being so clear to was not clear, right? We thought we were sales enablement, and then we were sales engagement, because there's so much difference between those two phrases. And then we were revenue automation or something like that. Yeah. And then it became clear. So the application actually was the journey. The messaging was clear. Who we thought we were selling to had several rounds of revision over time through dialing and tuning for the ICP, right? And then that also ultimately came to life through clearer positioning for our category. Yeah,
it was interesting. I think with Chili Piper, even when they started, I feel they were very clear with what they described. They described a product, how it worked. I feel that at the time we joined, it was which was still very early in the company, but it started to become this thing where it's trying to create some type of new category or trying to create something that is stepping a bit away from just explaining the product by what it actually is. And that's to Kaylee's point, it was buyer enablement at one point, and then it was inbound scheduling automation. It was, at the end of the day, it was a product that you put on your demo form, and it automatically allowed people to be able to schedule a demo, and it qualified them and routed them. And I think when people just understood what the product did, right, and then were able to easily connect that to a very specific problem that it solved, the product basically in a lot of cases could sell itself. But I think sometimes we get caught up in larger messaging concepts and trying to the category creation, especially in a lot of cases, and it just muddies the water.
This is not a category creation episode. That'll be a 90-part series, by the way. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well,
we're just gonna tee it up for you so that you have plenty to work with if you get there.
I was gonna say, fun fact: Chili Piper was the first B2B solution I was ever a buyer for. And it was not what the product did necessarily that caught my attention and made me champion it back. It was the way that Chili Piper talked about the problem itself. So we had this massive problem in my last company where we were getting leads as sellers 6-7 days late. And by the time we'd email them, they're fuck you. I wanted something 6 days ago. And so what was really, really attractive and what made it stand out and made me raise my hand and say we need to spend money was the way that the person who I heard talking about Chili Piper was talking about that problem. That's what sparked my attention. I was that's what we keep messing up. That's just it. I had faith if someone knew that problem well enough, they probably had a good enough solution for it worth bringing to the table. So I think that's a perfect example of a place where I was activated by Chili Piper's problem narrative probably more so even than the solution narrative.
That's a good point. I remember like instant inbound was like something that caught on pretty well. I feel like, Kaylee, like when we started talking about this idea of like instant speed to lead and just this idea of, trying to coin the term of like the opposite of what most companies were doing, which was like taking forever to respond to a lead. Yeah. Yeah, but it was interesting. Like I look back on a lot of times at Chili Piper, I would go like 3-4 months down the road and you'd be working on something. And then you'd look back and be like, why did we do this? Like, why didn't we just keep it with like the simple, like I remember like the hero on our homepage and the graphic was like so clear in explaining what was going on here and and just everything. And then you just get to a point later and you're like, how did we get here? Right. It's like it makes no sense.
I relate to that because, and I think this is part of the struggle that I had when I was at my last company, is like you have the CEO's vision and what gets investors excited and what builds, a $1 billion company or a $10 billion company in theory. And that's in the future. That is so far ahead of where buyers currently are today, the problem set that they have. And then you work on it with the founder, that is a challenge in itself, trying to balance the future and the present. And then you get it over to sales, and sales is like, what is this? So what I did this second time around at User Evidence was, rather than, just go work in a Google Doc by myself, I went to go talk to Evan, our CEO. I went to go talk to the sales team quite a bit. And then I listened to Gong recordings before I even put any like hands on keyboards doing anything related to this. And I think the more that you can kind of understand what the North Star is or what the future vision is, but also see what people are currently struggling with today and anchor more around that, like that's how you get sales a little bit more excited about working with you on a project, because they know they'll actually use it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that when sales can, I think like to answer, like kind of pile on with what you were saying in the beginning, Jen, about like, why don't most salespeople use the messaging? It's kind of, a lot of times it's just not, it's not practical. Like it's not actual messaging they can take and use on a call. Like it's not just, I think that especially when you give people scripts and you give things like that, like it's just not, they're like, you clearly don't know what I do because what you've given me, I can't use. Right. And so I think that working with sales is like so important to make sure that if you're a product marketer now and you are starting to create messaging in your sales-led company, like if you're not going to the sales team early and just getting them involved in the process, you're just setting yourself up for a lot more pain and headache than you want. Like you're going to have to do it eventually.
You three are exceptional marketers, right? The average marketer out there is in many cases so closed off from other things besides what the company does, right? So it's like they know everything about the product, but that's only useful, again, if someone values the need to buy your product. What I think is the perfect place to start, in my non-marketer opinion, is to get, to your point, Jason, like sales, marketing, product in the room and have a conversation on like, what is the current state for how most people solve this problem today? And what is the pain of having that be the way that they solve the problem? Because until we can get a prospect to believe that something is inherently way more costly, way more risky by staying the same than if they change, it's like we don't even have a sale to make, because that's the first fight I have to win. And that, again, is the place I think it's just largely underserved. I mean, if I had a prospect who's like, I really want to buy sales training and I read the Challenger book and I just love you, like, how do you do it? I never struggled there because marketing was always churning out content for that. But if I had someone who's like, I'm weighing, do I buy Gong or do I buy sales training or do I, hire more salespeople? I really struggled to win that fight because I'm like, I don't know, I can show you what our sales training can do. And I think that's largely what the position that a lot of sellers are in today. And that's the hardest part, in my opinion, of the whole conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like people always throw around the concept that status quo is your biggest competitor. And it's kind of that, but it's not. It's almost like there's so many, the majority of deals, 40 to 60%, like never make a decision. And it's for that reason, right? They're just not convinced that they need to make a change at all. And it's to say that you're losing to status quo almost makes it seem like there was a deal to begin with that you could have lost and you lost the status quo, when in reality, like there never was a deal to begin with. And so I do wonder if sometimes we need to like think of it a little bit differently, where it's like, we got to convince them to buy anything. Then we decide who we lose to. If you lose to status quo, you really just lost to not being able to convince them there's a big enough problem, which...
That's absolutely money.
Yeah. Yeah. That is interesting.
Are you forming that thought in real time? Because it seemed like a really great, already formed concept.
Smoke is starting to come out of my ears.
We're done here.
Working overdrive here.
So, Jen, I'm not trying to get you to bash on your previous marketing teams, but have you like worked through this before and seen this go well? Like, where have you seen the most success with this sort of thing?
Yeah, we had the same. Marketing created this message in a vacuum. They took 6 months to create it. They rolled it out at our sales kickoff, and everybody was like booing. It was awful. It was freaking awful. But the reason was they didn't have context, right? So what we were getting is collateral and pitches and sales decks that were like, here's why Challenger is better training than, Richardson or Winning by Design or whoever else. To Jason's point just a moment ago, that was rarely the fight that I was in. And so what we had to do as salespeople is come in and say, here's actually the fight that we're up against. I've got to get that person who maybe knows that their training sucks, but thinks like, of all the things I'm going to do, am I going to pull people off the line? I've got to get them to believe that this is actually the right lever to pull. And so we sat in a room together with product, marketing, and sales, and it was ugly, but we sat there together and said, what actually makes someone believe that they need to solve a training problem? And where we ended up after, I think, like 2 full days of yelling at each other was, if you can look at your pipeline data and you can see that you're losing like 40% of your deals to status quo, then all of a sudden you're like, I need to train my sellers to defeat status quo. But that's the end of the argument. So what we realized is our messaging had to illuminate for prospects, how do you know that you have a status quo problem? And so instead of going in and saying, here's why we're the best training option in the world, and here's why you should start today, and here's why your training sucks, we'd go in and be like, okay, I noticed that you sell, I don't know, like tractors, and you're trying to get your sellers to sell warranties for those tractors. Well, selling tractors and selling warranties are night and day. And I bet your sellers are having a hard time convincing someone to buy that warranty. Yes. Okay. That's a small validation. Great. So have you looked at what is the conversation that they're having to try to sell that warranty? Well, no. Okay. Well, can you go back, pull 5 close loss opportunities and see what does that conversation sound like? And let's come back together next week. Here's what I think you're going to hear. And then sure enough, next week it was like, yeah, that was pretty much it. Right. So none of that is about my solution or Challenger training or anything like that. It was giving sellers a way to give the prospect an opportunity to self-diagnose, shit, I have this problem. And that is just so massively different. And I do empathize with marketers because it does require like a relinquish of control. I have to give sales the pieces and I have to trust that they put it together. And that's not easy. I get that.
Yeah, I really like the point about, and just like what you talked about there about getting everyone in the room to like figure it out between sales and marketing. Like I have the idea of like, where do you start to? And like the only way that those types of things actually work is when, so I've worked with a lot of product marketers who might work with their founder. They might work with a CMO. You might have all these people who are bought in to a particular type of like messaging, a new narrative, whatever. Like when there's some type of new piece of messaging that needs to get worked on, if it's a new feature or like a product launch you're doing, a lot of times people will be like, okay, well, this is brand new. Right. So I'll like, if this makes sense to me, okay, let's roll with it. But if it's trying to like reshape something that they're so close to this current pitch deck and this current messaging, like unless you have the person that they listen to fully bought into it. So like, I remember like I've worked on messaging lots of times and the VP of sales or the, CRO or whomever is kind of just like, you see them in meetings and they're kind of just like, okay, yeah, like not really into it. People can sense that. Like people can feel that. And when it comes time to roll that out, no one is going to be on board with it because they just don't, it doesn't seem like they need to if that person's not into it. But I remember even at Uberflip, we had this new VP of sales. His name was Benny. And Benny came in and he right away had like people loved Benny and all the salespeople like he had so much credibility, and they would listen to everything he said, and he always had their best interest at heart. And like, he was just one of the better sales leaders, like best sales leaders I've ever seen, in terms of being able to just rally the salespeople behind him. And I remember when he was like, okay, we need to update our messaging, and we need to work on this new pitch deck. And I was able to work with him, and we did there was a number of things we did with this really interesting, like, whiteboard exercise where we like trained people on how to write it out on a whiteboard and all this. But when we figured out like what the new messaging was, and he rolled it out to the sales team, everybody listened. And I think too, it's like, tie it to something they're motivated to, like tie it to some sort of, you tie it to a certification, you tie it to something where they're measured on that. But I think a lot of times where messaging falls flat, and I see it all the time with other product marketers, is that the sales team is not bought into it. And for a bunch of reasons, right? Like what you talked about, Jen. But I think that if you're right now listening to this and you're like, okay, we got to work on new messaging this new year, it's like the person you have to get behind, even the messaging needs to change, should be your head of sales or whoever it is that has the sales team's ears, and get them bought in, and then work with that person especially, because you want them to be really jazzed about your new messaging, and then adoption will kind of take care of itself, in my opinion.
So we did something similar at Metadata, and it was pretty funny in hindsight, and it was pretty funny going through it in the moment. I had all of the AEs, like I've worked with them to basically tell me how they were pitching Metadata, and I would get the pitch from them. I'd kind of take some notes on what was being said, the words they were using, the words they weren't using, and the problem that, Metadata solved. And what I did was I went to one of the sales directors at that time and said, hey, I just talked to 10 AEs and I got 10 completely different responses, and no one's talking about the company in the same way. So like, I knew that the messaging needed to change, but just because little Mark is saying, oh, we should change the messaging, like that's never going to work well. But the second that I took it away from me and said, hey, your sales team is talking about what we do, how we do it completely differently, then that was a light bulb moment of, all right, I think we might need to do something here.
I like that. Kind of goes to your whole point too, of like, Jen, even if you're selling anything as a product marketer, you have to sell a lot internally. Like you've got to sell like, hey, this needs to change for a reason. It's like, you need to tell people why even change what they're doing right now. Because I do feel like a lot of times sales reps are like, I'm fine, I'm good with this. Right? Why change a good thing?
So Kaylee, in your role, and I know it's changed a little bit now based on you doing your own thing, but like you have a very unique lens in all of this as it relates to DemandJen, because you're constantly testing stuff. So like, how do you take what you're trying out and learning and try and say, hey, product marketer, look what I'm doing over here, and look what data I have to show you about, what's landing and what's not landing?
Yeah. Well, I think to like pull Jason into the fold, because obviously he's here, we should. Jason's the first like product marketer I'd actually ever worked with, even though I'd worked at, I don't know, like 4 SaaS companies before that. Every other product marketer like sat with the product team and and that was like back when you like worked in an office and they were always like down in a dungeon and they were like very isolated and like remote, and I'd like never seen them. I like heard about these people but didn't know like what they looked like or what they did, or the value was like not obvious to me at all. So I was like, right, product marketer. So like, to Jason's credit, he's like won me over with the value of product marketers, because I truthfully had no idea what these people did until 4 years into my career when I met Jason, which was great. But I think that forming, like, as I came in like negative Nancy, oh my gosh, like how am I supposed to work with this guy? Like, what is our role? I don't understand. Like, I just actually was very naive.
You hit it pretty well.
Well, I just, Jason's just so nice that I like loved him as a human, but I was confused. But I was confused about like how we were supposed to form a function that cross-pollinated like so seamlessly when I had never, ever seen that value before. And in hindsight, as Jason and I started working together and building a rhythm of sharing feedback and, oh, I learned this thing today, or I was in this pipeline review call today, thought that might be helpful for something you're working on, or whatever, just small nuggets of a rhythm between the two of us, it actually made it really obvious to me of like, oh, that's like all these other problems now are so apparent to me at previous companies, because this engine was so broken, like missing an entire cylinder. Like, how in the world are we supposed to be operating when nobody literally talks to the other person? So it seems very simple in hindsight, but alignment between, for me, selfishly, between a demand gen as a function, which is what I've always led or leaned into when I was in-house, and product marketing is so critical that now when I'm looking at new clients and trying to understand how I can lean in and where I can actually provide value before I ever sign an SOW with them, I'm always like, cool, but let me talk to your product marketer, which I would have never done before because that connection was not obvious to me. But to your point, like, my success and fail at a company solely depends on the messaging. So sales is also looking to me to be like, what the hell are you doing? You're passing us crap leads. And it's like, well, I'm telling a crap story, like, I don't, I'm working with what I've got too. Like, let's try and close the gap. So it really is a three-pronged stool that is more important than ever. Like, one of these companies that I'm working with now, actually, we were at a conference together in the fall. The sales leader was there, and I saw that Andy Raskin, strategic narrative guy, was there leading a session. And I was like, hey, 115? Ballroom C, we should do that one. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a good one. And he's in there feverishly. He's opened his notes app on his phone, just taking notes. He'd never been exposed to strategic narrative or that framework, or even just like talking about telling a story for your business. His eyes were quite literally being opened in real time. And I'm just like, we're sitting at these conference tables or whatever. I'm just sitting right behind him. I'm like, yes. He immediately goes back and he's on Zoom with everybody. Oh my gosh, this guy, we learned about this thing. We need this. And to Jason's point about Benny, same thing, right? Mm-hmm. There's like when you have a strong sales leader, there's nobody better that can rally that team to say, hey, this is a problem. I've seen the light. We have the same problem. Let's go solve it. And then it's really nice for me to just be able to plug in and say, here's the data I have from what we've been testing in market. Here's what I know from the outbound function or from your SDRs or whatever your system looks like. We don't have to get into all the functions, but let's pull all of that together, because like, I'm always the data person. Normally the product marketer is a lot better at telling the actual story. And then you've got somebody to rally the troops, quite literally, with your sales leader. And that's when the magic happens. Otherwise, you're literally going to be pulling their teeth out all day to convince the salespeople that you know more about how to sell this thing than they do. It's never going to happen.
Yep. So we've talked a lot about what not to do, which I think is super valuable in itself. But when rolling it out, like, what would you recommend a good way of rolling new messaging out? Let's say you've done all the hard work, you've borderline killed each other in the room for being locked up for 2 days. You had the hard conversations, you're putting pen to paper. How do you go about this? Because it's not just this big unveiling. Like, it seems like it's a gradual process, no?
I definitely think it's gradual.
I think it's gradual. I think if it's done in one fell swoop, it's a fail.
Agreed. Yeah.
Done that multiple times. Don't do it anymore. But yes.
Yeah, we did. So like, I've got something pulled up because in the product launch course that we teach, like I kind of talk through like a couple of processes that we went through to actually like roll out messaging. And this is with like, say, in the case here, like this is when Clue was requiring double check. So like, it was an interesting one because you're acquiring a services company. There's not a lot of like product, especially in the beginning stages, that was included in it. And so the process that we went through here, because it's less of a teaching people about product, but it's more about what is the net messaging. And with this, in the case of this too, it was like kind of changing how we position the company. So it was pretty substantial. Like, we're bringing on this new company. We're now this together. We're a bit of this new thing. And so the way that how this process worked with us is like in that first meeting that we had with the revenue teams. So it was like sales, CS, we had the account, like it was basically all these customer facing teams were in that meeting. That was where, after we had worked together to come up with like what that messaging might be, we had that first meeting and we shared V1. And it was very much this meeting where you're like, guys, this is just version 1. So we want to share with you where we're at right now and walk you through it. So like we walked them through that. I basically had a couple of slides and then basically some high level messaging. And I presented it though as if I was presenting it on a call sort of thing. But then we used most of that meeting to get feedback. And so it wasn't like, here it is, sales, run with this. It was like, what do we all think of this? And so, you know, you might say that's a bit by committee, but it wasn't really. It's not like together we're all voting on this, but it was like a chance to get it in front of people and hear feedback. And then after that, like what we did was on that call, a couple of like more senior reps piped up with like feedback, being like, hey, like what if it had this, or it feels like it's missing this, like, so some good feedback. And so after that call, it's like a matter of, I worked with them, a couple of those specific reps, and like we got the messaging and the slides to a much better place, right? And so it was good then because they were really bought into it and they were willing to go and test this out on an actual call. And so not only do you get it to a better spot, you get the buy-in from some more senior, like credible reps, but then you also get them to go out and test it, and they're like kind of bought into giving it a go and like seeing how it goes. And so then once we finally through that process got it to a good point, then we brought everyone in and we're like, okay, we shared the materials with them before we brought them into the next session. And that was where we're going to do like live training, break out, practice this on each other, come back. We're going to pick a couple of people to pitch it live. Eventually with this, what we got to was what is kind of like an asynchronous pitch contest. So we had everyone, finally, when it was all said and done, give everyone the chance to like check out the materials, practice this, but they just recorded themselves on Loom pitching this, like recording this pitch. We picked the best, and then we came into a live session where they actually presented it to the CEO of Clue and DoubleCheck, and they picked the winner, and the winner got $500. So it was like an interesting way to actually try to work on the messaging with sales. Now in particular, this is like obviously like with the revenue team to get them all bought in and understanding the messaging. But that was like a way that we rolled that out. And I think that if anything, it's kind of what I really like about it is very much like a collaborative approach. It's not like, here's your messaging, going. It's like, here's where we're at right now. We're going to work with you on it. They're much more bought into it when it's all said and done.
Jen, do you like get excited to test new things out if done well with marketing, or what?
I'd live for
Tell
it.
the truth, Jen.
Nothing that excites me more. No, in all seriousness, Jason, I love the way you talked about it, because I think so often marketing is fearful of the skeptics or the top performers when those are actually the people you need to win over the most. So I would pick your loudest skeptics in your sales organization. I'd pick your best performers. And I would say your best performers are probably already ahead of goal or on the right track for it. They're going to be the ones that are most likely to try it in prospect conversations because they've got less to lose. Your lowest performers are like scared shitless to say anything out of the norm because they feel like if I do anything different, I'm going to mess up this deal, which they're probably not going to win anyway. So get your highest performers to try it out with prospects, because we can all sit in rooms and be like, I love it. It sounds great. But what we really need is that circle loop back of prospects being like, this logic makes zero sense to me. Or have you thought about this way? And I think we all have customers that are probably happy to do that with us. But I do believe prospects are our biggest source of truth because customers root us on. Like they're going to give it to us in a nice way. I want that prospect who like violently disagrees with it. And then to Jason's point, we learn all that. We adapt it, and then we go back to the sales organization and say, don't worry, we're not asking you to try something that's been untested. Jen used it over here with this deal, and it's why she was able to change the trajectory of this deal and win it. And I think that, like, we salespeople are always looking at what's that person doing that I'm not, and how can I replicate what they're doing? So if marketing has proven it out with sellers, the way that Jason described, like, you're just going to reduce that change resistance farther than anything else we can do.
So when do you know, like, when it's time to maybe start tweaking it or making changes? Because, Jason, how you rolled it out is how I've started to roll it out, you know, at Metadata and out here. I get a little mini focus group of AEs, get them excited and on board with it, and then have them be the champions of the message. But it's not a set it and forget it type deal, or if it is, you're doing it wrong. So, like, how do you know, hey, maybe we need to tweak something, or how do you get that feedback from sales?
So one, I most times you don't have to go asking for it. Like, you're going to get the feedback anyway. So luckily, like, you're going to get, I think in general, as long as you, as a product marketer or a marketer, like whoever's watching this and is working on messaging, as long as you have a pretty good relationship with sales, like, they're going to come back to you and tell you why they think it's not working. But I think proactively, like, some of the things you can do is listening to calls. Like, especially when you're rolling out messaging, I think if you can take the time early stages to actually listen to calls where, if this is part of your pitch, right? And that typically, like, the first call you have with a prospect, this is being used. listen to those calls and you'll get a good sense of how it's going. Luckily, like at Clue, for example, we had an enablement team and sales managers also did just ongoing coaching with the reps that they managed. And so if you can work your pitch and the new pitch and the kind of the certification into, okay, well, this is something we're going to monitor now and make sure all these reps are keeping up on that. Like our enablement team was kind of doing that. And so we were able to actually, we rolled out a certification like this. Like we were able to measure it in a sense, to know how many are certified. And then our enablement team was like, okay, from here, we're going to make sure that these reps are actually using this new messaging. So that's great. But I think in terms of just the more, offhand kind of word of mouth type feedback, like I do think you're going to get a lot of that, which is challenging because you don't want to listen to it all. Like you got to take it and try to, not jump to conclusions all the time. But I think that those are, with sales, those are some of the ways. Kaylee, I'm sure that you have a lot of feedback too on the more like out in the market, like how to work and see.
That's what I was going to say too. I think that like if the only person on your marketing team is listening to sales calls is your PMM, like you're already not doing it great. I find no chops for PMM. That is not my skill, not my lane. Totally fine to admit it. But I always find so much value in listening to sales calls as part of my weekly routine, whether it's a client or whether I'm in-house or it was through an agency partnership, whatever the case may be. Because the way that I think about applying it to the programs that I'm running is probably a little bit different than how Jason might think to give me a piece of enablement to go apply. I'm just much more in the weeds of my programs than Jason will ever be. So like everybody that has a stake in outward facing comms on your marketing team should have some role in listening to sales calls and feedback. And there's definitely like great ways of tagging and foldering and stuff like that to like create a good system so that people aren't just like wasting hours of their life either filtering through Gong or whatever your recording system is to go find those nuggets of feedback. But I think that that's really important that you have so many stakeholders around the table listening and consuming that feedback. And then obviously testing and applying it in market. I think that it's one thing to go and find the Jens who are overachieving quota of the world and take them under your wing and have them, be excited to go test. I think it's another way to de-risk some of that testing is to go ahead and give it to your DemandJen marketer to go test in market, whether that means your DemandJen team is overseeing your SDRs or they're actually overseeing some of your media programs, right? So third-party sponsorships, social media outlets, billboards, podcast advertising. There's so many places that you can also go apply these stories and get that feedback loop and form that pattern, particularly like test and control, right? Everything with test and control.
I love it. We are just about at time. So Jen, I feel like for how hot you came out of the gate that you were going to not make 2 more marketing friends, but I feel like you may have actually made some friends in marketing here. Is that fair to say?
Oh my gosh, this is a first.
I think for, getting your perspective from a seller's perspective and Jason from, really the foundational product marketing perspective in all of this, and then Kaylee and how you test this out in market and kind of create that feedback loop that we all dream of. It was interesting to hear horror stories of how to not do this from your past experiences and more importantly, how to do this. So, super happy that you all were able to come on the Proof Point, and I'm sure we'll have to do another episode in the future, but thank you for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
This was awesome.
That was a lot of fun.
Great being with y'all.
Thanks, Kaylee. Thanks, Jen.